Hi, this is S.G. Brownlow, and I'd like to welcome you back to my three-part series on how to screw up your own emotional life. So, if you haven't watched video 1 on avoiding and replacing, I'd suggest you do that. I think you get a lot out of it. If you have watched it or don't want to watch that one, let me sort of give you the brief overview. We talked about how a lot of times people avoid some kinds of painful emotions by pretending that they have other emotions that are less painful. In my experience, an awful lot of what we see people do when they're trying to act happy and content is actually putting on a face for other people. I gave an example of a pretty extreme case of that I had known the woman when I was in my early 20s. And in that video, I also talked about how for a number of years I had assumed that all defensive emotions really had that same character of wanting to show one emotion so that we wouldn't experience another emotion. I don't think that that's quite exactly what's going on anymore. And what started to change my mind is that I started realizing that although anger, for instance, is very typically a defensive emotion, that people could be angry, but I would have a pretty good idea what was behind the anger. I could tell if they were sad, if they were scared, if they were ashamed, if they were disgusted. I knew what was behind that anger after a while. And I knew how to help them reach that. In explaining how I knew that, other than just saying, well, it just felt like this, was very difficult. Explaining to other people how to do that. And then I was given the idea of fused emotions. And I picked it up from Les Greenberg. And it wasn't something that I'd really read in his writing, but it was something I heard him talk about in a workshop. And I realized that when we think about fused emotions, sometimes we think about, okay, this person is putting two emotions together. But sometimes it's really that they're not so much putting them together, but that they haven't learned to really differentiate them and pull them apart. Maybe their parents fused those two emotions consistently, or their culture fuses those two emotions consistently. But one way or another, those two emotions are fused. So let me give you an example of a fused emotion and how I dealt with it. This happened fairly recently. My wife and I had made up our mind one weekend that we were going to spend a night out of town at a hotel in another city. And so I'd made the reservations. We were all ready to go. We were looking forward to it. The morning we were going to leave, she and I were laying in bed and just kind of talking. And she asked me a question. And I was trying to answer it as well as I could. And the way she'd asked the question, it sounded like she really didn't know much about whatever it was she was asking about. So I was trying to really explain it to her. And somewhere in there, she got upset with me. She just started complaining. And you always do this. You always talk too much. You know, I'm sorry I asked a question and this kind of stuff. Okay. Typically, this would have gotten into an argument. somehow she was complaining, and she was complaining about the way I answered the question, and that was going to trigger some of my adequacy issues, and I was going to respond angrily, and we were going to get into this angry exchange, and we were going to end up not talking to each other most of the day and driving to this other city, fuming at each other, and things were just not going to be pleasant. But I was thinking about fused emotions at the time, and I realized that her complaining was really a sign that there was some sadness in there. And so rather than responding to the content of her complaining, what I asked her was what it was she was afraid she was losing. And what she told me was very interesting. She said she felt like she was losing a piece of herself, that I was just engulfing her with knowledge, and she was losing sight of who she was. Wow. I can understand where that feels desperate. That feels like a significant loss. And it's something that until somebody frames it in terms of loss, you're not going to think of it that way. You just hear somebody talking too much and you get frustrated, and it's like, why don't you shut up and let me have a conversation with you? And so I was able to empathize with the fact that she felt like she was losing something, to back down off of my need to be right, or my need to be adequate, or my need to be really anything, and just relate to her on that need. And what that managed to do was save the day. We didn't end up having the big argument. We ended up having a great time on our drive. We ended up having a great time at the hotel. We ended up having a great time in this other city, and we ended up having a great time returning home. But it was all because I had been thinking about this, and I realized a fusion when I heard it. And I was able to stay out of my own stuff and not take it personally. But fusion is something that we do all the time. When we hear complaining, when we hear frustration, when we hear anything like that, when we hear griping, those are all very common fusions of anger and sadness. And as long as we treat those as feelings, as primary things that we need to express, that we need to talk about, they're essentially impotent. They'll keep us from getting what we want.